welcome back to another episode of Tearing Up Your Bible. Today we're going to hop into the book of Daniel. We're going to do two things here in the book of Daniel. We're going to put a timeline in, and then we're going to put a chart that kind of maps out the book of Daniel and how it's arranged. Now, I think that both of these are going to radically change the way that you view at least a few things in Daniel. So I hope it's beneficial. I hope it's something that you're interested in doing in your Bible. And if not, at least follow along and learn something new about Daniel. So what we're going to do is we're going to begin by putting in just a code. We're going to pick out a color from our pens, and we're going to mark all the times that a time frame is mentioned in Daniel. So we're going to look for times that, like in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. That's going to be one of those things we're going to look for. So what we're going to do is we're going to mark our key here at the top. We're going to mark all of the markings throughout Daniel. And since I have some extra space at the end of Daniel in my Bible, I'm going to go ahead and put a chart right here in the back. So I'm going to go ahead and mark all of that up, and then I'll be back to show you what that looks like in just a moment. All right, we have made those notes. Went ahead and put my key at the top of Daniel, and then I started making the notes through Daniel. There is one extra thing to make mention of. Here in chapter 1, in verse 1, the author writes, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem to besiege it." Now, I have put a date of 605 BC, but it doesn't mention exactly when in King Nebuchadnezzar's reign this occurred. Now, Jeremiah chapter 25 and verse 1 tells us it was the 1st year of King Nebuchadnezzar's reign that this happened. And so I went ahead and made note here that this is 605 BC, and with a cross-reference to Jeremiah chapter 25 and verse 1 to let us know that that's where we find that information. All right. Here at the back of Daniel, we have our chart that gives us all the information that we have marked throughout Daniel. Now, Daniel is in captivity during 2 different kingdoms' reigns. We have the Babylonian kingdom and the Persian kingdom. So these will denote that here on the left-hand side of the chart. As you move over here into the right column, you'll notice here that we have all the dates written in red. These are the dates that we have already marked throughout Daniel already. And then we have the events that happened during those time periods. And then over here on the far right, you'll notice that there's something interesting. That Daniel, for the first couple chapters, seems to be moving in a chronological fashion. Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3, and Chapter 4. But then something happens. We have chapter 7 as being the next chronological event, where we jump to Belshazzar's 1st year in chapter 7, but we get his last year in chapter 5. Now that's unusual. And then we move on into chapters 10 through 12, which is going to be Cyrus's 3rd year, and that comes after Darius's 1st year also. And this may be something that changes your perspective on Daniel quite a bit. Chronologically speaking, Darius's reign is going to be the last thing that happens here in the book of Daniel. And chapter 6 fits in that section of text. Sometimes we have it in our mind that Daniel was still a fairly young man whenever he was thrown into the lion's den. But as you rearrange Daniel chronologically, you'll notice that Daniel is an old man when he goes into the lion's den. And that may change your perspective completely of who Daniel is at the time that he goes through this process of being tried. At least it did for me. Now, as you notice the fact that all of Daniel seems to be out of order chronologically, that may ask the question of why. Why is Daniel arranged in this fashion? And this is going to lead to what we're going to put here. We're going to put a flow chart of the book of Daniel, and we're going to pick out a couple really interesting things that maybe you have never seen in Daniel before. So I'm going to go ahead and make this flow chart up, and I'm going to walk you through it and explain everything in just a moment. Okay, we have our second chart drawn up here at the back of Daniel, and let me explain this. Now, Daniel is usually divided into 2 sections. Chapters 1 through 6 is the narrative of Daniel, and starting in chapter 7 on through chapter 12 is the prophecies of Daniel. And so you usually divide it into those two sections. But there is something really interesting that happens here in Daniel that doesn't really happen in other places of the Bible. The narrative begins here in Hebrew, and chapter 1 is written in Hebrew. And then it diverts from Hebrew into Aramaic. Now, Aramaic being a sister language that was spoken primarily by people around Israel. And chapters 2 through 7, not chapters 2 through 6, are written in Aramaic, and so they go together. And then we revert back to Hebrew in chapters 8 through chapter 12. And so if you divide the book just by its languages, you would get chapter 1 by itself, chapters 2 through 7 by itself, and chapters 8 through 12 by itself. So let's dive a little bit further and see why this is. So chapter 1 is Daniel taken into Babylonian captivity, and he has his first trial. That moves over into chapter 2, where Nebuchadnezzar has his dream about the four kingdoms, or the statue that is interpreted by Daniel as being four kingdoms. Now, chapter 2 then moves on into the fiery furnace, where you have the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego not bowing down before the altar or the statue that has been erected for them to bow down to. And then you move on from there into chapter 4, where Nebuchadnezzar is going to exalt himself. He's going to walk out and proclaim what a great kingdom that he has made, and completely forgets about the God that he has proclaimed back in chapter 3. And then from chapter 4, we move out of chronology to link chapter 4 with chapter 5, where we have a similar story of Belshazzar also being proud and arrogant, and he is humbled in the same way that Nebuchadnezzar is humbled, or a similar way that Nebuchadnezzar is humbled. And so even though chapter 4 and chapter 5 do not flow chronologically, they are linked together in the same style of story. They tell the same message. What happens to Nebuchadnezzar happens to Belshazzar. And then from chapter 5, we move to the last story chronologically, which is Daniel in the lion's den, which, as you can consider, is paired very logically with chapter 3, where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had their testing at the king's hand in chapter 3, so Daniel also has his testing. This is where, in chapter 3, they are delivered miraculously, and in chapter 6, Daniel is delivered miraculously. And so even though these stories do not happen really anywhere near each other chronologically speaking, they are paired together in the theme. And then as you move from chapter 6 on up into chapter 7, you have Daniel that has a dream that he cannot interpret, and he has to be given the interpretation. In the very same way that Nebuchadnezzar was given a dream in chapter 2, and he could not interpret it, but he had to wait for somebody else to come along and interpret the dream for him. And so you have this beautiful symmetry that happens from chapters 2 through 7, where these sections are paired together, and that is denoted by the fact that they are written in Aramaic. And then as you move into chapter 8, we move into Hebrew again, and Daniel has his second vision, followed by chapter 9, where Daniel prays and confesses his sins and the sins of his people, followed by Daniel's third vision that spans chapters 10, 11, and 12. And I would suggest that there's a possibility that the arrangement of Hebrew to Aramaic to Hebrew is to give us this flow throughout the book, where chapter 2 is paired with 7, and chapter 3 is paired with 6, and chapter 4 is paired with chapter 5. There's also another thing that could be considered in this section. In chapter 1, Daniel has his trial whether or not he is going to keep the Jewish food laws. And that is really only something that's important to the Hebrews, and maybe that's perhaps why chapter 1 is written to the Hebrews. As you begin chapter 2 on through chapter 7, Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego mostly deal with people outside of the Jewish faith and the Jewish community, and maybe therefore is written in Aramaic. The things written here include things that are told to and written about individuals who were not Jewish. And then as you get from chapters 8 on through chapter 12, you then get Daniel's prayer, which is going to be his confession of his people's sins, the Hebrew sins. And you're also going to have two other visions of Daniel that are primarily directed towards the Hebrews, saying what is going to happen and what they're going to suffer. And so chapters 1 and then chapters 8 through 12 seem to be directed towards the Hebrews, while chapters 2 through 7 are also kind of directed outwards towards others as well. And so you have this beautiful flow that goes throughout Daniel. And if you're wondering how I made the chart, even though this isn't nearly as nice as I want it to be, I simply just made a little cutout here and a stencil and drew all this out and then filled it in from there. I hope that this has been somewhat enlightening to Daniel. I know that going through this process has really changed the way that I look at Daniel and the stories that are here. It helps me to see why the chronology of Daniel is so out of place by seeing how the book flows and understanding the underlying language behind it. I hope that you take some time and go through Daniel yourself. I will have pictures for this chart and for this chart listed in the links below, and then you can use them at your leisure. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for spending some time in the book of Daniel, and Lord willing, we will get to see you in the next video.